Sorry, I'm getting this streaming, get it all set up. So welcome everybody. My name is Abby and I'm an educator with the Asheville Museum of Science in Asheville, North Carolina. This is our Ask a Scientist series that we've been holding weekly on Fridays during the pandemic shutdown. It's been going really well and we have had lots and lots of really cool guests. And if you're curious about any of our previous videos, we have them all posted on our website and in our Facebook page. Just gonna let some more people in. All right, today we have a really awesome speaker from Cornell University, Jennifer Uehling. She is a PhD student there. She studies stress physiology in birds in the Vitusic lab. I think I said that right. If you're unfamiliar with some of the resources that Cornell has for birding, they have some really awesome things such as the site allaboutbirds.org, maybe. .com, not sure, but they have some amazing resources. They're really well known for their birders. So I'm excited to have one here today. And Jenny, you can go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm just gonna share my screen here for a minute. Okay, great. So I have a couple of slides that I wanted to show you guys, and then I'll stop throughout as well and show you some stuff today. Some equipment I have here to study birds. So yeah, like Abby said, I'm a PhD student at Cornell in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And before I get started with talking about my research, I just wanted to tell you guys a bit about how I got started studying birds and kind of some of the past work that I've done. So as an undergraduate, I worked with Steve Pruitt-Jones at the University of Chicago to study non-native parrots in the US, as well as fairy wrens in Australia. And those studies really got me excited about birds, and especially thinking about bird spatial distribution. So for the parrot study I was looking at the distribution of non-native parrots across the United States and thinking about what factors might explain their distribution. So there's over 20 species of parrots that are breeding here, and they're not native. So that's kind of a story for a different time, but that project got me really excited about spatial ecology and thinking about how animals are moving and why they're moving to different places. And so here at Cornell, I'm focusing on movement ecology of birds and also stress physiology of birds, and working with Marin Vitusic, whose picture is right there. So before I jump into some of the methods that I'm using, I just wanted to give you guys kind of an overview of what it is that I'm studying here at Cornell. So I'm really interested in how variation in individual animals' movements affects their survival and reproductive success, and also the different factors that affect their movement decisions. So we can think about this with this kind of figure I've made here. So I study tree swallows specifically. So if we think about tree swallows, I'm interested in the external factors like weather conditions, and internal factors such as hormone concentrations that are affecting their individual movements. Whoops, that's not supposed to happen yet. And then how those individual movements relate to their survival and reproductive success, and ultimately result in their different levels of fitness. So fitness is just the total number of offspring they have over the course of their lives, and basically how they're contributing to the population. So we can kind of boil that down to the question, what are the causes and consequences of variation in movement strategies? So that's kind of what I'm focusing on for my PhD. But today I just wanted to talk about a couple of different things loosely organized in this list, and I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have as they come up. I'm going to make sure that I have my chat window open so I can see them. Okay, so first I'm just going to talk about general field methods that we use in field ornithology, and that I've been using since I first started studying birds. Then I'll talk more specifically about bird tracking technologies, because obviously I'm interested in movement, so I'm really interested in different methods that we can use to study bird movement. And finally, I'll go more specifically into what I am doing with my own tree swallow research and methods I'm using. Okay, so one of the first questions that people always ask me when I say I study birds is, how do you catch them? Which is a great question. But I first wanted to start with just talking about why we would actually catch birds to begin with. So there's a lot of methods that you can use to study birds that are that don't require catching them. So you can go out with your binoculars or spotting scope and your ears and listen and look for birds and count how many there are in different habitats. And obviously that's a very non-invasive way to study them. You're not disturbing them or bothering them. But we can't really get as much information we can't get a lot of certain types of information from just going out and looking at birds because we can't track what individual birds are doing. And we also don't know much about the specific characteristics of each individual because it's hard to tell how large a bird is and how much it weighs by just looking at it. Obviously you can't. So we catch birds because we're really interested in understanding more about the individuals. We're interested in understanding their mass, how their mass might be affected by different environmental conditions. We want to follow individuals and see where they're going, and obviously we can't do that unless we mark them in some way. So it's important that we are able to actually catch these birds to more deeply study them. And all right, so there are a lot of different ways of catching birds. I work on a songbird species, and so my perspective on this is a little bit biased, but I'll tell you some of the ways that I've caught songbird species in the past. And there's obviously very different methods for catching larger species and different species in different habitats. So with songbird species, a very common method used to catch them is with mist nets. So this picture on the right is a picture of me. I couldn't find a better picture of a mist net, which is kind of sad because this is a little bit of an embarrassing picture with my lab mate standing in the background posing there. But we were out listening for tree swallows and we caught this eastern kingbird by accident, or he just flew into the net and we were trying to catch swallows. And so you can see though here, the mist net is essentially like a big volleyball net. And the idea is that you set it up in an area where you know the birds will be flying by. So you basically want to set up the mist net in their flight path essentially. And if you set it up well, which this mist net is pretty visible, but if you set it up well, then the birds hopefully won't be able to see the mist net and they'll just fly straight into it and get tangled. And then we untangle the birds and take them out of the net, take measurements on them and let them go. For tree swallows, which are the species that I study, we actually have a much easier time catching them most of the time because we're really lucky that they nest in nest boxes. So this is a picture of a nest box on the left. And nest boxes are, so tree swallows are cavity nesters, which means that they will nest naturally in tree cavities, but they'll use these nest boxes as a good alternative for that. And with nest boxes, it's really nice because you can just essentially block the entrance hole and you caught the bird. So when females are in the nest box incubating their eggs and keeping them warm, you can usually just sneak up on the nest box and put your hand over the entrance hole, reach inside the nest box and pick the bird out. And so it's actually really easy to catch them. During other periods in the bird's breeding cycles, it's a little bit harder to catch them because it's harder to sneak up on them and they're not sitting in the box as much because they're going in and out of the box to feed their nestlings and go find food and then bring it back. And so we use other methods to catch them. So one way that we do that, and I'm going to stop screen sharing here for a minute. Oh, and I see a good question here that I'll answer in just a sec. So one way that we do that is with this trap that we call a wigwag. And so this is essentially a little piece of plastic. I'm not sure if you can see it. There we go. So this is a piece of plastic and we put it inside of the nest box. There's a push pin here. So we put it inside of the nest box around the opening of the hole. And then it's attached to this fishing line. And so we back up and we unfurl the fishing line. And then we watch the box very carefully. And when we see the bird go into the box, we pull the fishing line and it causes this piece of plastic to come over the entrance to the box and block it. And so we are able to catch the bird that way. I see a good question here. Do other birds ever invade the nest box? Yes, they do. So tree swallows, the species that I study, I'll talk about a bit more later, but they're native species that use nest boxes in North America. Other species are bluebird. Other species that might use nest boxes in tree swallow habitat are bluebirds, sometimes black-capped chickadees, but there's also an invasive species called the house sparrow that uses these nest boxes, and house sparrows can sometimes kick tree swallows out of them. They're pretty aggressive. They occasionally will kick tree swallows out, and yeah, which is not the greatest. But I think you guys have talked about invasive species before in this segment, but house sparrows were introduced here, so they don't occur here naturally. And so, yeah, we don't really like to see them use the tree swallow nest boxes. We do occasionally see tree swallows injured based on house sparrow damage. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again quickly here and keep going. Okay. So, okay, why and how do we catch birds? We covered that. Okay. So then the next question that I wanted to talk through is what information do we collect when we capture birds? And here I will stop my share again because I want to show you guys some stuff that we use. So I'm in a lab where we study hormones, and we study the specific hormone called corticosterone, which is sometimes colloquially known as the stress hormone. Essentially, corticosterone helps animals respond to stressful situations. So when animals encounter stressors like bad weather or a predator or a human that seems like a predator, their corticosterone levels go up. And we're really interested in understanding the variation in those levels and how that is related to tree swallow survival and reproductive success. And so the first thing that my lab does when we catch a bird is we immediately take a blood sample. And this is because we want to understand what the corticosterone levels are like before the bird ramps them up really high in response to the stressor of being captured. But another reason that we collect blood samples is that we're really interested in several other things. So one thing we're interested in is understanding the relationships between different birds. And so we can understand, basically, we can figure out how related different individuals are. We can understand, and this is all from blood samples. The interesting thing about bird blood samples is that their red blood cells are nucleated, so they have a nucleus, which means that you can get a lot of genetic material from them. So you just need to take a tiny bit of blood in order to get that. So I see here, what is the volume of a bird blood sample? So that's a really good question. And it depends on what species you're working on. So honestly, you really only need a tiny little quantity of blood to get enough genetic material for DNA. For measuring hormone levels, you need a bit more. So we typically take around 30 microliters of blood on each blood sample that we take. Sometimes a lot less, depending on how well the bird is bleeding. When it's really cold weather, it's a lot harder to get a good sample just because the bird's much colder. Yeah. For the hormone levels, we need around 5 microliters of plasma to measure the type of hormones that we study. And so that means that we need around 10 to 15 microliters. We can get by with like 3 microliters of plasma. So we're able to get by with quite a small blood sample. It's really tiny little pinprick. Okay, someone asked, how much time do you have to gather the blood sample before the hormone enters the bloodstream? So that's a really good question. It's a question that a lot of people argue about all the time. But for my lab, the general rule of thumb that we use is that we need to get a baseline sample. So that's measuring the baseline amount of corticosterone that was in the blood before the bird got stressed out. We need that baseline sample before 3 minutes have passed. So essentially, the minute our hand goes over the nest box entrance, that's when the timer starts. And so we're trying to get our blood sample before 3 minutes have elapsed. And then the standard procedure in our lab is to then hold the bird for 30 minutes in a paper bag where it's quiet and dark, but still we're waiting for that those stress hormones, that corticosterone, to basically ramp up to the level that we would expect it to potentially peak at, and we take a sample at 30 minutes to get those stress-induced levels. Do you have to perform steroid extractions on the plasma, and how do you quantify your hormones? Yes, okay, that's a great question. So yes, after we take the blood sample, we spin the blood down and we extract the plasma from the red blood cells, and then we put the plasma in a freezer. And it sits there for a while until our field season ends. And then for the entire academic school year, we do corticosteroid extractions. So this is essentially done by mixing the plasma with different chemicals, and that will essentially allow us to extract the quart. And takes quite a while. After we've extracted the quart, we perform what are called ELISAs, and those are used to quantify the amount of quart in each sample. Yeah, so it doesn't end once we finish our field work. We have to then go back to the lab and do a lot of heavy lifting there in order to get the final concentrations of the hormones that were in those samples. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit more about what we do after we take those blood samples. So one thing that we do and that others do as well is we take malaria blood smears. So a lot of some researchers, including one in my lab mate David, are really interested in the prevalence of malaria, which is a disease in birds. And it's actually not the same disease in humans. It's a different malarial strain in birds. And so what we do is we take a tiny bit of that blood that we've taken from the bird, we put a little drop of it on a slide, and then we smear the blood on the slide. And that is then used to look at the blood cells under a microscope and to look for malaria cells. Okay, so then the next thing that we'll do after taking this initial blood sample, always we put a band onto the bird. So these are metal bands, and they're issued by the USGS, and they each contain a unique identifying code. And the specific size of bands that you use is dependent on the species that you're working with. So tree swallows, obviously, these are really, really tiny bands because tree swallows, the species I work with, are really tiny birds. But if you're working with a larger species, there's different standard sizes for those species. And additionally, if you're working with different species that live in different habitats, so say like a shorebird species, you have to have special types of bands because these aluminum bands would be really susceptible to corrosion from salt water. And so there's special types of bands that you use for species that are in different habitats. The bands do not contain any like chip or anything. They're just engraved with this, how many digits is it? 9-digit code. So for example, this is the next band that I'll use when I band a bird. And the code is 2811. 74217. So basically, we're banding the bird in order to tell its identity. So if we catch the bird again, we'll know who he or she is. And the bands are also really cool in that even if we don't catch the same bird again, someone else might catch the bird again. And that means that we'll have more information about where that bird went. And that's really cool. So for example, one time I was out mist netting with my lab mate. We were trying to catch tree swallows. We caught a yellow warbler that just happened to fly into our net. And we went to band the bird because every time you catch a bird, you put a band on it. And we noticed that the bird was already banded. And we were like, this is really interesting. I wonder if we caught this bird yesterday or something, because oftentimes younger birds will just fly into the net multiple times because they haven't learned yet that it means that they're going to be captured by humans. And we noticed that this band was kind of an unusual code that we didn't recognize from the US. And it turned out that that bird had actually left Colombia about 2 or 3 months prior and had actually flown to the US. And we knew this because we recorded the band code that this bird had, and then we contacted the folks from South America and found that, that the bird had been banded down there. So that was really cool. And that's one kind of unexpected cool outcome of banding, is we're able to even track birds across many different countries. Okay, so how often do the bands fall off? They fall off very rarely. So when we put the bands on, our goal is to make sure that it's completely closed, and a good rule of thumb is to make sure that your fingernail can't fit between the opening. So as long as that's the case, I haven't really heard of many instances of bands falling off. It's totally like a bird's social security number. Yeah, so the bands, the birds have to be caught again for the bands to be read. Do the bands affect the birds at all when they're going about their lives? No. So, I mean, I think there have been a couple of studies that have looked at how different types of bird marking affects bird behavior. These bands are really, really small, and unless they're put on poorly, which obviously is never the goal and very rarely happens, it doesn't really affect the bird at all. Yeah, it's kind of just like a ring or like a piece of jewelry that the bird is wearing. Okay, so after we band the bird, then we take a couple of different measurements. So standard measurements from my lab include the length of the wing. So we use this ruler to measure the length of the bird's wing. And essentially you just kind of scoot the bird's wing up on this little ledge, and then, yeah, can measure how long the wing is with this ruler. We also take the length of the bird's head and bill. So we use these calipers to do that. So you just roll these open and then close them. This is a really hard measurement to take because we're aiming to put the back of the calipers right at the widest part of the bird's skull. And so sometimes you have to take it a couple of times just to make sure that you're getting consistent measurements. And then we also take the mass of the bird. And so to do this, we use this little spring scale called a pesila. And essentially what we'll do is we'll put the bird inside of this little coin envelope. And then the pesila is tiered or adjusted such that when it just has the coin envelope, it's at 0. So once the bird is inside, we're able to figure out how much it weighs. Okay, so yeah, those are the main things that we do when we catch birds. My specific research involves also putting radio tags on birds, but I guess I'll get into that a little bit more later. I'm going to share my screen again to keep talking through bird tracking technologies. Okay. So now I'm just going to do a brief foray into background about tracking technologies. So obviously I'm really interested in bird movement, and one of the best ways to study bird movement is with tracking technologies. So I mentioned that story about the yellow warbler that was recaptured in a different country. That actually doesn't happen super frequently. So we were really excited when that happened. But normally when you put a band on a bird, it's just really uncommon for someone to actually like be out and like capture the bird everywhere that it goes, basically. That just wouldn't happen. And so in order to actually follow a bird everywhere it goes and to follow it over the course of many months or many years even, we need to start using tracking technologies. So there's been a lot of exciting advancements in bird and other animal tracking technologies over the years, especially in the last 10 years. So this picture on the left here is a picture of a California condor. I'm not sure if any of you guys recognized it. It's a very endangered species that's only found out west. And this bird, I'm not sure if you can see it super well, but this bird actually has a little tag on its wing. And that tag is really heavy because this bird is very heavy. So California condors, if you've ever seen a California condor, are massive. They're really huge. And so because of that, they're able to carry much heavier tags. So in the US, we have a rule that says that the radio tag and attachment or anything that you put on a bird must weigh less than 3% of the mass of that bird, which is a really important rule because it means that we're doing our best to prevent any negative effects of these tracking technologies on the birds. We want to make sure that they're not carrying too much for their body size. So you can imagine, like, if you had to carry around a backpack full of like 75 pounds of like heavy textbooks all day, that would really impair your movement. And so we're thinking about this from the same perspective for birds. We want to make sure that whatever we're putting on these birds is not negatively affecting them. So this California condor is what one of my mentors would call a car battery bird, because it's able to have a really heavy tag on it, and it's still much below this 3% body mass weight. So this tag will be able to track where the California condor goes, and that tag can communicate with satellites and basically tell us where the bird is most of the time. On the other hand, this tag on the right, so this is a blue-winged warbler. This is a species that I worked with briefly, and it has what's called a geolocator on its back. And geolocators are another way to track where birds go, but the problem with them is that because blue-winged warblers are so tiny, the weight of that tag that's on the California condor is probably like more than the weight of the entire blue-winged warbler. So we can't use tags like that on smaller birds. We can use this geolocator, which is the proper mass for the bird. But the problem with this geolocator is that the bird must be recaptured in order for us to figure out where that bird went. So you can't see it super well, but on the photo at the very bottom of that tag, so there's like this like black little tag here, and at the very bottom there's these two little nodes. And essentially when you recapture the bird, you connect those nodes up to a device on your computer, and then you're able to read out every time, basically the date, on every date, the time of sunrise and the time of sunset. So this is like a light sensor tag, and then it's able to tell, you can figure out from those data where the bird was for the entire year. So this bird in particular had a tag put on it 1 year, and then a year following that, we recaptured the bird and we were able to figure out where it went from the information recorded on that tag. So in recent years, the problem, so I mentioned like the problem with this geolocator, right, is that you have to recapture the bird in order to download the data and figure out where the bird went. And sometimes it's pretty hard to recapture the bird. Someone was alluding to that earlier, that, you know, we're lucky with tree swallows that we can recapture them. We reliably know where they went. They're going to their nest boxes, so we can recapture them relatively easily. But there are a lot of species that we really can't do that with. And so there's been a lot of advances in recent years to basically solve this problem and figure out a way to track smaller animals with lighter tags. And so one really cool organization that's been working on this is the MODIS project. And so this project, if you go to modis.org, you can learn more about this. But essentially, MODIS is a network of towers that are set up listening for transmissions from tags. And actually, I think this picture of the locations of all of the towers is a little bit outdated. I think there are a lot more now. But this picture on the right side here, those little yellow dots are the locations of towers that have antennas that are just listening for the signals from these tags. And then these glued on tags are constantly transmitting. I think it depends on what model you get, but like they can transmit every 2 seconds or every 10 seconds, but they're constantly sending out this signal that's a unique identifying code identifying the bird, and then the towers will pick up that signal, and so we know when the bird flies by a tower, which is really cool. So I would definitely encourage you to check out this project. It's such a cool project. Recently, another cool tag that's come out that I've been working with are these what are known as LifeTags. So they're solar-powered radio tags. And I had mentioned before that one of the tags that you can use with a MODIS system is battery-powered. And the problem with battery-powered tags is that the battery actually weighs a lot, and so it's a little bit limiting. With these solar-powered tags, obviously they're powered by the sun, and so they don't even need a battery, and they can last in theory for forever. And so these tags were originally developed for use with tree swallows, and they're now used on many other species. So that species down there on the far right is a sanderling. The species on the left is a tree swallow, one of the birds that I study. And these are super, super light tags. So they're 0.6 grams, which is really nice when you study a bird like I do, a tree swallow, which is 20 grams, because it falls within that 3% mass. And sometimes tree swallows can be up to like 25 or 26 grams at times. So it really does fall nicely under that 3% body mass rule. Okay, I'm just gonna make sure, I'm gonna start sharing again. So now I want to talk a bit more about the research that I do specifically on tree swallows and how I'm using these tags to understand tree swallow movement and behavior. So this bird on the left, obviously, is a tree swallow. Tree swallows are what's called aerial insectivores, so that means that they eat flying insects. They're pretty common in the United States, so they're found across North America, and actually Asheville would probably be one of the most southern places that they might breed. They definitely migrate through that area. We had a group of researchers that sometimes studies these birds in Tennessee. They breed all the way up to Alaska, so they have a really large breeding range. In the area that I work specifically, so that's in the Northeast, in Ithaca, New York, tree swallows are actually declining. And we're not really sure why. There's been a lot of theories and different possibilities suggested, but that's one of the reasons that I'm studying them, is to try and understand different factors that might be leading to their decline. So as I mentioned, I'm using, and I also, just to reiterate, they're cavity nesters. So in natural settings, without humans around, they would nest in tree cavities. Holes that are created by woodpeckers, for example, they don't make the holes themselves. But if humans provide them nest boxes, they'll readily use them. And so we have a number of sites across the county that have nest boxes set up that tree swallows use. So I'm using these LifeTags, these solar-powered radio tags on tree swallows to track their movements during their breeding season. And okay, so this is one of the sites that I work at in Tompkins County, close to Ithaca, New York. And I'm not sure if you can tell, but there is some snow on the ground there. So this photo was taken in the middle of May, and we had this really terrible bout of really cold, snowy weather in the middle of May, which was right when the birds were just about to start kicking off their breeding season and start laying eggs. So suffice it to say that the weather here is a little bit unpredictable. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is understanding how tree swallows are modifying their movement behaviors depending on the weather conditions. So as I mentioned, tree swallows eat aerial insects. And when the temperature goes down and when it gets colder and colder, the number of aerial insects declines. And so when this happens, tree swallows will oftentimes go try and forage in areas that are a bit more thermally buffered, like along streams or in areas with larger bodies of water. And so I'm trying to understand the variation in that behavior among individuals in the population and how that relates to their reproductive success and their survival. So to do this, so I mentioned that, I see a question here. Okay. Okay, I'm not able to see the questions right now on my screen, so once I finish going through the rest of the photos I have, I'll answer the questions. So this is a photo of one of the stations I have that's listening for signals from these tags. So if you look really closely, you can see at the top here is an antenna. So this is what's called an omnidirectional antenna. So it's receiving from all directions equally. So you can also have directional antennas that would be like the more typical, like if you think about like a radio antenna that's on the top of your roof or something, like that would be a directional antenna. So this antenna is receiving transmissions from the tree swallows that I tagged, and then it's recording them on a flash drive in this little base station that is in the middle of this pole. And the whole business is powered by a solar panel. So this is a very green project. The tags and also the stations are powered by the sun. So I have a number of these stations set up around the county, tracking where these birds are going. So the two sites that I work at here are in triangles. And then the locations of the towers that I have set up, tracking, listening for signals from these birds, are red. So you can see I have a lot of them set up in the immediate area around the sites that I'm working at, but I also have them set up further afield, especially over here by Cayuga Lake, which is, again, as I mentioned, a large body of water where they might go when it gets cold. So I'm out there listening with all of these antennas to see where these birds might be going. Okay, and then I also wanted to briefly talk about another way that we're tracking these birds, and that's with these RFID tags or PIT tags. So I'll show you one of these in person here. So this is the tag that I'll put on a tree swallow. So this is the life tag itself right here, and then glued to the very top of it is a PIT tag. So the life tag is giving us a sense of the bird's longer range movements, so around the county or around the site. The PIT tag, or the RFID tag, is actually giving us a sense of when the bird is feeding its nestlings and when it's going in its nest box. So you can see on the left-hand side here, there's a nest box that has this like little black thing around the opening, and that's actually an antenna that reads every time the bird goes in and out of the box, and it identifies the bird based on this unique code that's transmitted by this little RFID tag that's glued to the top of the life tag. And so basically, I'm able to get from these birds both information about their long distance movements and where they're going around the county, as well as their more smaller scale movements when they're going in and out of their nest boxes. So I'm able to see where they're going, and then when they come back, when they're feeding their nestlings and how frequently. So this is also just a close-up of one of those antennas that goes around the entrance of the nest box. I just nabbed this photo of a tree swallow female inside of her nest box recently, and I was pretty proud of it. So you can see her kind of peering out as I'm driving by out of that RFID antenna. Okay, so I am going to answer some questions now. So are you seeing any trends in the number of tree swallows nesting in Tompkins County or elsewhere? So we are seeing a decline in the number of tree swallows nesting here, which is unfortunate both for those of us that are doing research here, as well as for those of us that are, as well as for the birds, obviously. So there have been a lot fewer birds in recent years. The population that's been studied here in Tompkins County has been studied here for around 30 years, and there's certainly fewer numbers than when that began. I don't know of exact percentages of decline, but they're definitely declining. How do you decide where to place your antennas? I set them up around the main site where the birds are breeding, but then I also have set them up in sites around the county where they might go when it gets cold, for example. What is your recapture rate after you band or attach a tracker? So, well, so far it's 100%. So I was out this morning recapturing tree swallows that I tagged over the last couple of weeks. So as I mentioned, one thing that we're really interested in is how are these hormone levels, corticosterone levels, and one particular question I'm interested in is how corticosterone is related to movement decisions. So we know that higher baseline levels of corticosterone are related to higher activity levels, and so I'm really interested in how this hormone might be mediating birds' movement patterns. And so we captured these birds once during their incubation period, and that's when they're sitting on top of their eggs and warming them and getting them ready to hatch. That's when I put on the tags, and then we catch them one more time when they're provisioning their nestlings. So that actually happened this morning. We caught 4 of the birds this morning and ensured that their trackers were still attached, and then let them go, and they'll be able to transmit for the rest of the time that they're breeding in the area. Unfortunately, some of the tags do fall off. So this morning, 2 of the tags fell off, which is very, very unfortunate. I glue them onto the birds. So as I mentioned before, there's these rules about how heavy of things you can put on birds. And some people will use a harness to attach a tag to a bird, which for tree swallows is often made out of jewelry cord. But the problem with that for my study is that the tags that I'm using are just a little bit too heavy along with the, combined with the pit tag and the life tag, it's a little bit too heavy to put a harness on the bird. It goes over that 3% mass cutoff. And so I actually glue the tags onto the birds. And that's actually kind of nice because I'm interested in the data from the breeding season, but then the tags fall off and the bird, when the bird molts, so when the bird replaces all of its feathers, and so it doesn't have to carry this tag around for longer than it needs to. Okay, Molly asks, what is your recapture? Okay, how many seasons will you run this experiment? So the current experiment that I'm working on, this is my second season, putting these life tags out on birds. The first season that I did this, I was just focusing on natural variation in court levels. And then this year, we're actually doing an experiment where we're artificially increasing the court levels in some birds. And that's going to help us experimentally manipulate the birds and understand exactly how different levels of court among individuals affects their movement patterns. Okay. So I might do this one more season. It's been really challenging with COVID-19 restrictions. I've been really lucky that I've been able to actually continue doing research this season. My university approved some of my lab's research, and so I've been able to go out by myself and catch birds, obviously social distancing, but we usually have a large crew of undergraduates that help us. And they haven't been permitted to help this season, and so it's been hard to collect all of the data that we need, and so I may do this for one more season, depending on how the rest of the season goes. Where do the swallows go in the winter? So tree swallows will often winter some of them will winter in Florida or Louisiana, in the southern US basically, and they actually have a really cool migration pattern. So a lot of songbirds will migrate at night for many different reasons. Sometimes because they use the stars for navigation, or it's a little bit safer because there's not predators out like there are during the day, like large raptors, for example. But tree swallows actually migrate during the day, and that's because they're aerial insectivores, and so they're able to forage on the wing while they're migrating. So that's really helpful because a lot of other species that migrate at night are not able to eat while they're migrating, and so they can't just have little snacks along the way, and they end up losing a lot of mass and then have to stop over at certain places and try and rapidly regain energy before they can keep going. Whereas tree swallows can be a bit more leisurely in their trek along down to Florida and Louisiana. Yes, so some tree swallows will be in the southern US, some will go down into Central America, into the Caribbean islands, which is where I would go if I was a tree swallow. Okay, do you think COVID will affect any data? I've actually gotten that question from others as well. So I don't think, for the population of tree swallows that I study, I really don't think that that COVID is really affecting them in any way. I mean, we don't know, it's not in birds. Obviously the disease is not known to be in birds, but some people have suggested that maybe like human activity changes could affect wildlife during this time. And I would say, so I have noticed at one of our sites that we work at, it's kind of along this gravel road that people will often use just to go for walks. And I have noticed this year, it does seem like there are more people using that road than there have been in the past. And I think that's probably because people are maybe bored at home and like want to go out and spend time outside, which is obviously wonderful. But along the specific path that we have boxes set up, that seems to be a really popular place for people to go. And I do think that maybe that level of disturbance repeated, people walking their dogs, people having, making loud noises along that road could potentially negatively affect the swallows. But other than that, I'm not really sure of any specific way that COVID could be affecting the birds. Okay, what does court tell you about spatial distributions of birds? That's a good question. So it's a question that I'm trying to answer. So basically, court is related. Previous studies have shown that it's related to general activity levels and movement behavior. And so I'm really interested in how variation in court levels is affecting specific tree swallows' movement patterns and where they decide to go. and how far afield they travel when they're foraging for their nestlings. Yeah, that's a good question. Does anyone have any other questions? I can keep talking a bit about the work that my lab is doing, or I can also talk about like previous bird work that I've done too.
Yeah, you should go ahead and keep talking. We still have 13 minutes, so I'm going to use all of your time.
Great. So I guess I can tell you guys a bit about another, this isn't like a specific tracking method that's like tracking bird movements, but it is kind of a cool technology that we're using. So one thing that my lab is really interested in, and I'm also really interested in, is how much the temperature within individual tree swallows' nests changes. And so we use these things called, they're called Hobo data loggers to measure that. And so basically what we'll do is we will install a fake egg within each tree swallow nest. So this is what the fake egg looks like. It's not very convincing, honestly, but I think the tree swallows can tell it's not real. But anyways, this is the fake egg. And it contains a thermocouple inside, and so it basically measures the temperature at regular intervals, and then we're able to tell how warm the nest is and how warm the mom is keeping her eggs. And for me specifically, one thing that I'm really interested in is how adult movement behavior affects the temperature of the actual nestlings. And so adult tree swallows kind of face this trade-off when the nestlings are first born or first hatch. So they have to go out and forage for food for their nestlings, but also when nestlings are first born or first hatch, they can't thermoregulate on their own. And so they develop that further along in their nesting period. And so oftentimes the mom will sit on top of the nestlings and do what's called brood them, so keep them warm. And so I'm using these hobos and thermocouples to measure that behavior and see how frequently females are doing that, and then how that relates to their movement patterns. What are my long-term goals for myself and my research? So that's also a good question. The existential question of what do I want to do with my life. I would like to ultimately end up, I think I want to stay, I really enjoy teaching, and I really enjoy working with undergrads, and so I'd really like to end up working probably at a primarily undergraduate institution. In terms of my research, I'd really like to continue exploring animal movement and exploring the relationship between these internal physiological factors and external weather factors or human disturbance factors, and how they relate, interact, and how they interact to affect animal movement decisions, and how that ultimately affects animal populations. Yeah. Oh, clarify, hobos. So someone asked what hobos means. I actually don't remember what it stands for, but it's a common device used in various ecology research. So I can read this, but it says Hobo data logger, and it's essentially just used to measure temperature. And so people will use these in bird studies, but they'll also use them in many other studies where they just need to know what the temperature is in a specific spot for any period of time. So this hobo actually, this hobo was installed in a nest that actually the female abandoned from. So she started incubating her eggs, and then for some reason decided she didn't want to nest there anymore or whatever, and so she left, and she actually started nesting in her box right next to that. But I had this installed in the nest, and I actually just remembered, so you can program them to start at specific times, and so I had programmed this to start recording the temperature around the time that I thought her eggs were going to hatch. And I think it's actually recording the temperature right now, which I totally forgot about, because I uninstalled it from the nest that she was in. So I guess I'll know the temperature of my house for the next couple of days. Would you like to expand your research to other specific locations? So I would love to work, so my lab has actually done some work in the past looking at tree swallows across their range. And so one thing that's really interesting is to look at variation within a species across the entire range they live in. And so we work here in Ithaca, New York, which is kind of like in the smack dab center of the tree swallow range. But others in my lab have worked as far north as Alaska and as far south as Tennessee, and also out in Wyoming to look at variation in the species across those different sites. So I would love to kind of look at movement variation across those different sites as well, and see how tree swallows breeding in different types of habitats, how they have different movement strategies. How successful are the tree swallows at raising their nestlings, and does nestling mortality impact your research at all? So tree swallows, I would say once the nestlings hatch, and once they get past like this critical period around days 6 and 7 of the nestling development period, I would say we have a pretty good fledgling success rate. So a lot of the nestlings will grow up and leave the nest. Our sites in particular don't have a lot of predation. The 2 sites that I work at, we have seen some evidence of predation. Sites that other members of my lab work at have actually somewhat higher predation, because some of my lab members work around ponds that have minks hanging out in them, and so minks are a common nest predator of the species, at least where we work. And yeah, I mean, nestling mortality can, so I am really interested in like understanding how adult behavior affects nestling survival and success. And sometimes adult behavior, you know, if an adult is like feeding its nestlings really well, then all of its nestlings will be successful at fledging. Sometimes adults are not the best parents and will not feed their nestlings well, and then maybe not all of them will fledge. But what's really challenging is when you have situations where a nest will be just eaten by a predator, and so obviously that nest didn't survive, and then it's hard, like you can't tell, you know, if that nest had been cared for the entire time and had made it to fledging, like if all of the nestlings would have survived or not. So predation pressures definitely do sometimes affect like how I can interpret data. Another question about the hobos. So are you planting them in nests or boxes? So the way that we install them is by essentially, so there's this little piece of floss that's on the end of the egg. I don't know if you can see it super well. But we'll essentially take a knitting needle or a crochet hook and wrap this piece of floss at the end around the crochet hook, and then we go to the nest, we take the nest out. So we actually, we put these liners in all of the nests, they're cardboard boxes, and so the tree swallows will build their nest within the cardboard box, and then if we need to do anything with the nest, we can just take the nest out of the box and do what we need. But we will take the nest out of the box, put all of the real eggs in a safe cotton-filled little Tupperware, and then we'll use the crochet hook to basically push the floss to the bottom of the cardboard box, and then out like the bottom of the cardboard box, and then we secure it in place with this little pin, and then we basically just have the egg sitting there in like a natural position where the female would have the other eggs, and we put the other eggs around it. And then like this little wire right here is what connects to the actual hobo. So like there's a thermocouple, which is measuring the temperature inside of here, and then this wire kind of neatly goes out of the nest box, and then we put this thing under the nest box in a Tupperware. What is the youngest birds that you would collect blood from, and does age affect cord levels? That's a great question. So we do not collect blood samples from nestlings until day 12 of the nestling period, so 12 days after they hatch. You can collect blood a bit earlier, and in some species, people do collect blood. Like, it really depends on the species. Oftentimes, like, people will just take a tiny amount of blood for genetic information. So as I mentioned, the blood is very rich in nucleated red blood cells, and so you're able to get a lot of information from just a tiny little bit of blood. And so a lot of the times people will take blood samples from nestlings when they're younger, just a tiny bit, just to get that genetic information to figure out like who the nestling's parents were in many cases. Because sometimes even within a nest, the mom will mate with multiple males, and so then to figure out like who within the nest belongs to which male, you have to take these genetic samples. For the specific studies that I do, we actually take a lot more blood because we want to measure hormone levels, and so we wait until day 12 because at that point the nestlings are actually little chunkers. They're sometimes heavier than the adults at that point, and so they're plenty heavy to get a good amount of blood from with that very safely. And does age affect court levels? Yes. So with nestlings, we take these specific blood samples on day 12 just to standardize it. But the kind of stress response, there have been a number of papers, and I'm actually not super familiar with them, but there's a number of papers that look at the development of the stress response, the development of that ramping up of court in response to an environmental or any type of stressor. And that kind of develops over the nestling period. But I can't speak confidently about how it develops because it's not really an area I'm super familiar with. In terms of adults, court sometimes, so that's a really good question and one that I think a lot of people are looking at. I think with tree swallows in particular, it's a little bit hard to get at this question without a long-term data set because so we have many birds that will return year after year to breed in our population of tree swallows, but it's actually kind of rare because for the most part tree swallows have a lifespan of like 1.5 years. That might somewhere around 1.5 years. I don't remember the exact lifespan, but basically most birds will only breed for 1 or 2 years. And so it's kind of hard to understand how their court levels change over the course of their entire lives, but it's something that a lot of people are focusing on. Yeah. Oh, someone asked, will there come a point when your research will be complete, or is the project designed to be more of an ongoing compilation of data to be passed on? So for my specific research, I'm hoping to be complete in about 2 years so I can finish my PhD and graduate. And at that point, I'll publish, I'll be working on publishing papers that are summarizing my results. But in terms of the long-term data set that I mentioned, so tree swallows have been monitored at these sites for around 30 years, and we're constantly adding to that long-term data set every year. And there have been a number of papers that have been published using that long-term data set, looking at trends in reproductive success and how different types of insects affect survival and reproductive success. But I'm sure there will be many more that will come in the future years, just because having this long-term data set is super valuable and tells us a lot about bird biology. Yeah, thanks.
All right, did we have any last minute questions? We will be posting this video along with all of our others on the Asheville Museum of Science website, our YouTube page, and as always, they will be available on our Facebook page. Thank you, as always, for our amazing speaker guest and everybody that tuned into the call. Jenny, we wish you the very best in your research moving forward and hope that COVID doesn't slow things down too much. We are really excited about all the progress that you've made.
Thanks guys.
Yeah, so enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. We will be back next week.
Bye.